Hey guys, so Duelist Nexus is just around the corner, so as usual I thought I'd take the time to sort of highlight the some of the best new contenders as well as some of the new old rogue favorites that's going to enter the mix in our format, and also just provide kind of a cost breakdown to help you decide whether these are kind of cost efficient decks that you could potentially pursue. So before I continue, a big thanks to my sponsors as usual. Links and discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh supplies and Yu-Gi-Oh cards below, and so you'll notice that I actually have partnered up with Tier 0 Games and Card Brawlers now to provide some discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh singles as well as sealed product. So if you're looking for some DUNE pre-order still, or just any other Yu-Gi-Oh purchase, definitely go make sure to check these sites out. I'll link down below. And so let's just start with Infernoble Knight, and these decks are not really listed in any particular order of strength, and also I usually provide some kind of data for each of these decks, but we obviously are not in DUNE format officially yet, so there's not really tournament data to go with, so we'll just provide some generic overview of the decks and also the cost breakdown. And so for this list in particular, I guess there was some OTS tournament that did post DUNE format, and this actually came first place. And so Infernoble Knight, for those of you who remember or maybe are relatively new, early days of the pandemic, this was actually a tier 1 strategy, and back then, to be honest with you, it was a pretty degenerate strategy. Basically, it's sort of focused around like hand ripping in terms of, let's say, like Emperor Charles and Smoke Grenade, like it would pop it and rip a card. You also have Omega to rip a card, so it was really not fun to deal with. But now I'm really glad that this new iteration of Infernoble Knight cards from DUNE allows it to have its own original identity, where essentially, you have like the smaller warriors that can equip to the bigger ones and give it some kind of protection, but on top of that, you have like, let's say, Phoenix Gear for it can be a monster negate. You have Barone for the Omni negate. You have like the new Charles Link that can provide like spell trap negates, and also the Emperor Charles can provide some pops, and it has a pretty good grind game on top of that. It is a combo heavy deck, of course, so I think it's really cool that it's no longer kind of like a very annoying one to go against, at least. Perhaps I could be still wrong, but in terms of the deck list, $300 for this exact list including the side deck is actually not that bad, especially when most of the tier lists I'm looking at post DUNE, they have this at least at tier 2, right? And I think that's fair. I think this deck is really strong, especially when it goes first. And so if you look at sort of like the deck core, of course it's kind of subjective in terms of what you consider as a deck core, but for these cards at least, $100 for this is actually really good in my view, especially for a deck that's going to be as good as it will be. And now obviously, I took out like a card like Barone because it's kind of like a generic staple that a lot of people will have. So I think the most expensive card kind of in this particular list is the Herald of Chalice, so I think it's like $10 each, and also the new DUNE cards, the Infernoble cards at least, are actually not that expensive, and even something like Charles or Angel, like you could kind of like wait if you want it, because it's kind of still in like pre-hype prices, at least for the most part for a lot of cards in DUNE, because it has not officially come out yet, but we're getting there, we're pretty close. And so I think overall cost efficiency wise, this is actually very good choice. So next we have Adventure Synchron, and so it's kind of a pile-ish kind of deck, and I think, among the decks that's going to be in this video, this is probably going to be the best one strength-wise, and so, it's a very combo-heavy oriented strategy, and so it's pretty strong, right? Like being able to set up Barone, Patter, Crystal Wing, or Herald, and I've even seen some lists where they would actually just do like that Calamity Lock through Crimson Dragon, and, like targets like the Math Mech Synchro or something. That's how I saw it, and essentially, your opponent just can't play the next turn, so can be very strong. The deck in itself is actually pretty expensive, at least this particular list. I mean, you have, let's say, Revolution Synchron, which is a new card in DUNE that's still pretty expensive right now, but at least it seems like a one-off, hopefully. And then you have something like, at least in this particular list, the Illusion of Chaos, Magician Souls. Those are actually still pretty expensive. The Adventure Token definitely has gone down a lot in price and is a little bit more affordable, but still kind of chunky in terms of price. And of course, the extra deck is still pretty high, but you know what, it's also another deck that I think I'm seeing a lot of people put it in like tier 2 category. Maybe it reaches tier 1, so it's certainly expensive, but for a meta deck, I don't think anyone can say they're surprised. In terms of the deck core, I had a really hard time for this one in terms of what's considered as a core, especially the extra deck, so I'm probably pretty wrong, so you can certainly flame in the comments, that's fine. In this particular list, the Adventure Token stuff, I mean, sure, it's kind of a staple-ish. Some people may have it already, but, the deck is called Adventure Synchron, so I figure I have to include in the deck core. It's around like $70, $75 at this point for the core, so I think it's still pretty good now compared to what it was before. I'm not sure if like the Reborn Tengu and some of the Ant cards here if they are part of the core, or if some lists just don't play it. Again, Revolution Synchron is probably the most expensive one here, and then the extra deck, I wasn't really sure what to include, like a sell. Stardust, obviously, it's pretty expensive. A lot of other synchro decks can play it as well. I just took up a road in terms of cost because that's something that a lot of people probably already have. So overall, $200 is pretty expensive deck core, but you know what? We've seen some other higher end deck cores like around $300 if you watch my previous breakdown videos of these, so such as, let's say, like Branded or Dragon Link, tier 1 decks that were around that $300 range. So I think $230, yes, it's a little bit on the high end, but again, not too surprising. And then next we have Rescue A. So this is another new deck, or rather it's technically still exists, but you have some new support coming from DUNE, and it's another deck that I'm seeing tier list putting this at tier 2, at least for now. So it's a very interesting strategy, I find, just with this big guy being able to set 4 cards on its own, which is something I don't think we've really ever seen before. And while you might think it's kind of like a really back row heavy deck, and it does definitely have a lot of back row, but it's not like a floodgate reliant kind of deck, right? And it also has a lot of flex spots for hand traps as well. And so I think it's really cool. It has like a very different combination of interruptions, a Book of Moon or pop, like a negate. So I think that's pretty interesting. It actually has a good amount of combo aspects to it as well, as you can tell from the extra deck. So it's really interesting. I'm not entirely sure how well it's going to do in terms of regional success. I probably will. And so because it is a pretty hefty, expensive deck, it's certainly not cheap. But you know what, if you kind of exclude the side deck, like the main deck is really where it's coming from. Like Prosperity obviously is still quite expensive, but there's obviously a lot of staples that are part of this deck list. And so if you go sort of by the deck core, $160, honestly, it's not that bad, especially when most people are putting this deck as like tier 2, at least at the beginning, as we enter this Duelist Nexus format. Most of the cost is actually coming from the Hydrant, which is like $40 each at this point. But if you got that when it was cheap, then you're probably pretty good to go. So again, $160, while not cheap, and it's not at that Infernoble level kind of cheap, but I think it's still pretty solid, especially for a deck that's going to be considered as tier 2. And then now we're getting to kind of like the really rogue levels, and of course, Altergeist is not a new deck by any means, but it certainly did get some new cards in Duelist Nexus, which sort of helps it come back in terms of somewhat relevancy. And so Altergeist, for those of you not familiar, 4 or 5 years ago, this was actually a tier 1 deck as well, and so it's a very trap heavy deck, but again, it's not really a floodgate kind of reliant deck, so I have to give some props to that. It's kind of interesting, it does have some form of built-in negation through their traps. It has a bounce through Slickerus. It even has some battle protection through Concrete, and of course Altergeist Multi-Faker plus Imperm turn 0 combo is kind of like the thing back in the day, and kind of a meme at this point. And so I think with the new cards, it's kind of nice. It kind of gives a bit of a recursion in terms of being able to revive from grave, and also the new Link 4 can steal your opponent's monster and then also treat it as an Altergeist monster. And Hexia has always been pretty good, being able to serve as like a spell trap negate, and then you also have just like generic powerful traps like Solemn Strike, right? And it can also play Secret Village, which is pretty strong going first, especially because their cards having spellcasters in their archetype. So deck cost wise, this particular list was $200, but realistically, if you can kind of tell, most of that cost is coming from the Pot of Prosperity. So if you look at the deck core, it's actually dirt cheap, even when you include the new cards that are coming in Duelist Nexus. There's not really much of a hype price, I guess, in terms of the cards that are not out yet. So really cheap if you're looking for a very cheap rogue deck. This is certainly the way to go. I know this, especially up until even the early mid days of the pandemic, this was actually still one of the most played rogue decks in Dueling Book, which you would know if you kind of follow my channel for a while. This has always been up there. So you know what, it's always like sneaky good, and I'm sure it can get hopefully like a regional top or somewhere, and just to kind of show that it's come back, because it's definitely kind of surprised people where I believe it topped like Euros, or I think it was last year. So you know what, it still has some kind of potential. And then finally, we have another old favorite rogue deck in Unchained. So essentially, it's while it's not new, it did get some new cards in Duelist Nexus as well. And so at least back in the days that I played against this, kind of like early 2020, I guess, it was kind of like this blind second strategy that was kind of control-ish, and also just trying to pop their own cards and popping your cards as well, and just having a lot of triggers as their cards pop. And so looking at this list and just seeing the Kaiju Slumbers, I'm assuming they're still trying to go second. If you do play this deck, certainly let me know in the comments if I'm wrong about that. And I'm not sure where the side deck is for this one. I'm guessing in that deck profile video they just didn't show it. But you know what, cost wise around $200. I guess it's okay. As you can tell, again, it's kind of a lot of that has to do with the prosperities as well. And so if you look at sort of the quote-unquote deck core, around $77, which half of that is actually coming from the spell card, which is around $30 total. But other than that, you know what, it's been like one of the more favorite decks, favorite rogue decks to play that I've seen, at least in the early days of the pandemic. And I'm sure a lot of people, let's say even some of the bigger YouTubers, let's say Distant Coder and also Bear, they are kind of like Unchained fanatics, so I'm sure they're very happy to see this kind of support. And I'm really excited to see, hopefully it gets like a regional top somewhere and we get to kind of see it revive again. Alright guys, so that was it for the cost breakdown and overview of some of the newer contenders / old new rogue decks that are going to enter the mix post Duelist Nexus. Hopefully you found that helpful in terms of helping you decide which new deck to pursue in the next format. And so as always, a big thanks to all of you for watching. A huge thanks to my patrons as always for supporting the channel. Really means a lot, and well, take care guys.